They laughed the way men laugh when an idea is so audacious it sounds like a joke, too loud, too quick, trying to hide the fact that none of them really wanted to be the one to admit it might work. They laughed when somebody suggested bolting a tank gun into the nose of a bomber. They stopped laughing when a single shell punched a hole the size of a bathtub into a warship. A story told in bars and mess halls across the Pacific under the headline, "They laughed at his revolutionary tank cannon until it sunk a battleship." For the record, wartime retellings sometimes inflated the target. Mission reports refer to a heavily armed escort warship and a supply transport. But nicknames and legends have their own gravity, and the image stuck. A tank gun roaring from the open nose of a B-25, sending metal and water flying and rewriting how small wars were fought at sea. It was the morning of November 16th, 1942, and a grey Pacific sun climbed over a scatter of islands. Crews on the flight line watched the sky and the sea with the same helplessness. High above the convoys that threaded supply routes to Guadalcanal and other contested beaches, American bombers climbed and dropped, dozens of feet of copper and steel aimed at ships that were, by design, moving targets. The bombs missed. The bombs slipped off wakes, glanced from slanted decks, detonated harmlessly against open water. Machine guns chewed at rigging and wood, but could not stop a ship that was already steering and deluged with AA fire. Each missed bomb was a missed chance to choke a supply line. Each failed sortie a small humiliation that added up in the ledger of the campaign. On the ground, the math read like mockery. To hit a ship moving at 20 knots from altitude with a free-falling bomb required a gambler's tolerance for probability. Radar aiming was primitive. Dive bombers had limited numbers, and the torpedo runs were bloodier than they were decisive. And the Japanese Tokyo Express, fast destroyer and transport runs in the night, were the enemy's way to deny the United States the steady supply of men, food, and fuel that would keep the small offensives alive. In that gap between what doctrine promised and what combat actually delivered, ingenuity would grow like a weed. If you love hard, surprising history, hit subscribe. This is one of those stories that looks like a prank until it turns into strategy. The seed of the idea was almost insulting in its simplicity. If armored tanks could punch through other armored targets with a 75mm gun, why couldn't that same principle be used against ships? A tank gun delivered concentrated kinetic force and an explosive punch in a single projectile. What if that force could be applied from a plane that could fly low and shoot like artillery? Engineers laughed first. The Navy laughed next, though politely. Slide rules were brought out. Spring rates and rivet shear strengths were calculated while afternoons passed in calculus and pessimism. The numbers on the pages argued against it. Recoil force from a 75mm M4 tank cannon was not a polite shove but a brutal shove. Mounted on a chassis of steel and hydraulics meant to endure rolling fields, it would be one thing. Suspend that gun in the nose of a medium bomber, whose structure was a lattice of rivets, stringers, and fabric-covered control surfaces, and you invited popped rivets, buckled frames, and an airplane that would come apart the first time someone tried to fire it. The flight manuals did not have a line for tank gun in nose. The authors had not imagined such an insult to their careful calculations. Yet theory and frontline necessity are different languages. In the messy arithmetic of war, the men closest to the fight found a different set of numbers. There was Major Paul Pappy Gunn, spelled Pappy in the field folders, an artilleryman by temperament and a tinkerer by temperament's friend. There was Captain Ed Lehner, a pilot who had seen enough missions to be uncomfortable with anything that sounded like the comfortable plan. Mechanics and aircrew who had watched supplies be dumped into the sea and watched comrade after comrade come back empty-handed began to sketch on the backs of cargo manifests. Why not a gun that could be aimed, that could be fired in controlled runs at the waterline, that could punch holes low where ships could not shrug off the damage? On the front line the rules were simple. If bombs miss, find another way to punch holes in ships. The resistance was not just stubbornness. It was also fear of the obvious engineering problems. The 75mm M4 was no lightweight. Each round weighed roughly 15 pounds. The weapon's breach and recoil produced forces that could send shudders through any structure not designed to take them. A cannon that could be retracted and locked in a tank found new ways to punish an airplane. Recoil had to be tamed. Feeding a long, heavy round into a cramped bomber nose demanded an extra set of arms and a new rhythm. A pilot needed room to point the aircraft low and fast, and the crew needed protection from the blast and the spent casings. The math said the plane might survive one shot. It did not say what would happen after 5. And yet, out of the dust and grease under the corrugated hangars, people who weren't constrained by theory began to build an argument in metal and sweat. Men who lived with the airplanes understood forces as a reflex. Reinforce here, distribute there, accept some damage in exchange for a chance of hitting what needed hitting. They cut away the greenhouse nose of a B-25 Mitchell, that delicate plexiglass cockpit that made the bomber a scout, a navigator of open seas, and replaced it with a metal cone. A cradle, part spring and part hydraulic damper, was fashioned to accept the cannon's recoil. The cannon's breech had to be accessible. Someone had to load those 15-pound shells while the plane pitched and yawed and the enemy fired back. The cannoneer's station became a cramped hell of straps and elbow room, where the work was brawn, timing, and the kind of steady nerve that men in foxholes learn if they are lucky. They installed the 75mm M4, the Army's Sherman tank gun, but they did not cradle it like in a tank. Instead, they improvised a cradle that could slide and absorb, a system of heavy springs and shackles that let the barrel draw back with each shot and settle without snapping the airplane's spine. They shimmed in plates where the original nose had nothing but thin metal. They ran extra supports along the fuselage and beefed up the landing gear to take the change in the plane's center of gravity. They cut a door or port for the spent casings to exit. They wired a crude sighting system, a combination of pilot cues and the strategic use of 50-caliber tracer belts to mark the aim point for the massive round that followed. The test fire was supposed to be the moment the plan collapsed. The skeptics marked their watches. They expected the plane to shudder, rivets to pop like cheap jewelry, the instrument panel to crack, the glass to spiderweb. They expected a beam snapped from the fuselage like a twig. Instead, they heard a sound that no one had expected. A single thunderous bark that hovered between artillery and a bad thunderclap, followed by a noise like a door being slammed shut. The plane leaned like it had somebody heavy on one wing for a breath, settled, and kept flying. A shell arced and struck a target at range, punching a hole that was not cinematic vaporization, but something worse in its realism. A clean, high-energy impact that slammed through hull plating and carried explosive force into the ship's internal compartments. That first day of firing from the air, the cannoneer learned something in his knuckles and shoulders that no slide rule could teach. You built a rhythm. Load, slam, fire. The cycle became an act of choreography refined by urgency. The cannoneer, crouched in the nose, heaved a 15-pound shell into the breech, slotted it in, slammed the breech home, let the mechanism clamp, and then the pilot aligned the aircraft on his shallow approach. The gun bucked the plane back, and off came the spent casing like a reluctant confession. The maintenance crews counted on gravel and oil. Mechanics kept their heads near the tail and their hearts somewhere else. Early tests and training runs taught them two brutally practical lessons. First, the recoil system worked enough to save the structure, but not enough to make the aircraft feel normal. Every shot shook instruments, jarred eyes, and rattled teeth. Second, in combat, the big gun's psychology might be as potent as its physical effect. Small boats and barges, the soft underbelly of the Tokyo Express, could not mount the kind of resistance that a destroyer or escort could. But by hitting a transport hard, disabling a barge, or punching a hole at the waterline, You achieved the strategic objective. A convoy delayed, supplies spilled into the ocean, morale siphoned away. Their first real tests against enemy shipping were not the stuff of legend so much as the stuff of apprenticeship. A single round could split a freighter's hull frames or punch through an old tanker's thin plating and let the sea come in. The crews began to see results that theory had not predicted. A skip-shot technique where the gunner aimed to let the shell hit the water just shy of the hull so that it would skip and strike low on the ship's side, tearing away planking and letting seawater flood compartments not designed to take it. The cannoneer used the .50 caliber tracers, fired in strings from the B-25's side mounts, as an aiming reference. The pilot would bring the plane in low, mast height, sometimes lower, and fly a controlled, furious ballet so that the tracers marked the line and the 75 limited a round, enormous and inexorable, followed. One shell could, in particular circumstances, make a crater in a wooden or lightly armored hull that looked ridiculous against the size of the round. Men compared these holes to bathtubs, and the simile stuck because it captured the absurdity, the human scale of the breach, a clean, round cavity far larger than any human should expect. That single, precise destruction was a proof of concept. Hit low enough, sink the pumps, break the frames, and the sea will do the rest. It was not always immediate. Some ships limped for miles before succumbing, others went down faster. The important part in the calculus was the time lost and the supplies denied. Not every sortie was a textbook success. The cannoneer had to be both mechanic and athlete. He moved like a man performing surgery in a shaking vehicle because that was exactly what he was doing. Loading a 15-pound round into the breach while the aircraft rocked was a task that demanded timing and throat muscles of iron. It put a premium on the human body as a machine. Fatigue became as dangerous as enemy fire. There were moments when the gun jammed, when a spent casing failed to eject, and the cannoneer had to clear it cold with fingers blistered from the day's work. There were missions where AA fire peppered the nose, and a single flak fragment would ring something metallic in the gun cradle. In a few unlucky instances, shrapnel found the crew. Planes were lost. Men were wounded. The ledger of innovation kept a steady, anxious column labeled cost. Beyond the physical toll, the psychological effect on the Japanese was immediate and notable. Convoys that had once run in daylight now waited for the dark. Captains gauged the risk and sometimes chose to take a longer course around exposed channels. The logic was simple and brutal. A B-25 with a 75mm gun posed a new kind of threat that did not match any table in the action card of a sailor. It changed convoy discipline without ever firing a shot. As they refined the gun installation, incremental changes emerged. Crews shortened barrels when necessary, adjusted the spring rates in the recoil cradle, and trained cannoneers until their hands moved automatically. The B-25G was an early iteration with the 75 meters and a handful of machine guns, but feedback from the field demanded more, a better balance of forward firepower and suppressive machine guns to keep the AA gunners from lining up the cannoneer for a lucky shot. The result, among other experiments, was the B-25H, a model with incremental but significant changes, reinforced nose structure, different gun mountings, and an increase in forward-firing armament. The thought that began as a joke germinated into a family of aircraft that would, in later decades, leave a lineage to modern gunships. The obvious arc from a patched metal cone in a Mitchell to a purpose-built gunship is not a straight line, but the seed was planted in these field modifications. Focus forward, carry heavy guns, and accept the price for being able to put ordnance accurately and repeatedly into a small target. There was politics and professional pride to be navigated too. Higher command was slow to commit. General George Kenney, known for his pragmatism and his willingness to push the envelope within reason, watched the reports with interest and some caution. He did not rubber stamp every field improvisation, but he recognized that tactics must evolve to meet the operational reality. The airmen below were not purists testing in a vacuum. They were trying to make barges and troop transports stop. The delicate war-room arguments about doctrine were less persuasive in the face of a sea lane clogged by damaged hulls and silence where once had been a steady supply roar. The crews who flew the patched Mitchells developed habits that theory could not command. They flew low and fast, sometimes so close to the water that spray lifted to the windscreen and the smell of salt mixed with cordite and hot oil. They learned to pick targets quickly: fuel stores, engine rooms, forward holds. They found that one good waterline hit could flood compartments and buy time for other ships to catch up and deliver the coup de grace. They learned to use the 50 culls, not only for suppressive fire, but as a crude sighting system, to paint an aiming point so that the 75mm shell, with its long arc and smaller margin for error, would follow. In the cockpit, the pilot kept a grim watch on instruments that now behaved differently under each shot. The cannoneer in the nose let his body become the mechanism between ordnance and outcome. Technology aside, these missions were human operations with all the mess and valor of small units. Men joked to keep from screaming. Stories circulated about the cannoneer who would sing under his breath while loading shells, because songs steadied hands when bombs and shells did not. They toasted with beer when they returned, a brief ritual that tasted like victory and denial both. Morale in the air was often as important as the ordnance dangling from the fuselage. There was gallows humor too. One pilot is said to have quipped that their plane had a gun that would make a battleship cry, an exaggeration that would do its duty in headlines later. The quips were a brittle cover for fear that rarely found words. By the time the crews had moved from trials into regular anti-shipping patrols, the cartridge counters in the maintenance sheds had a new line item. The cannoneer's hands were toughened and scarred. The flight surgeons wrote notes about the tension in necks of gunners who had to load under roll and yaw. The mechanics learned to expect a day of frantic repair in which the cowled nose was stripped down and inspected as if it were a wounded animal. And the pilots learned to respect the limitations. They could bring lethal force to bear, but the margin for error was slim and the enemy was not blind. Word of successes traveled quickly, as victories and peculiarities do in wartime. That a patched-together weapon system could sink or cripple an armed escort and disable a transport became an anecdote that commanders in other theaters wanted to hear. The image of a tank gun firing from a bomber nose was a striking signal of ingenuity. For some, it was a horror. For others, a moment of ugly genius, a pragmatic answer to a tactical problem. Not every success was dramatic. Most were small and practical: a convoy delayed, a barge set on fire and left floating listless, a transport crippled and limping toward a shoal. These were not necessarily the grand, neat kills of doctrine, but they mattered. They changed the tempo of operations by forcing the enemy to change routine. The psychological pressure, the knowledge that a B-25 might show up during daylight and punch a hole into your hull, altered behavior. Small, persistent pressure produced strategic consequences. It was in that theater of incremental pressure that Captain Ed Lullner and his crew found themselves on another patrol. Lullner had the look of a man who'd learned to measure time by missions rather than hours. His eyes were the kind that scanned the horizon with a mix of calculation and habit. He trusted his crew in the way some men trust a good tool, not blindly, but obstinately. His cannoneer had become a figure of quiet competence, moving with a labor built on repetition and stubborn care. Major Pappy Gunn had a hand in the broader idea, but the men in the planes had turned theory into practice. Their radios were quiet at first, silver static punctuated by the distant clack of shipboard guns. A patrol sighting reported a convoy, not unusual, but the description carried the offset of something larger among the transports. From altitude, the shapes suggested more than a supply barge. Something with a heavier profile and a higher silhouette rode with the convoy. Maybe it was a modern myth in the making. Maybe it was one of those heavier escorts whose loss could actually tip the balance on a particular run. Whatever it was, the patrol commander ordered a sweep. The patched Mitchells banked and dove toward the coordinates. Men on the flight deck checked their gear with a practiced calm. The cannoneer aligned his fingers on the breech, like a boxer wrapping hands. The pilot breathed and set the plane to a glide that would be mast height when they came in, their speed tuned to the gun's ballistics. It was precisely the kind of mission the patched Mitchells had been born to fly. Low, fast, and brutally precise. As they dropped toward the convoy, the first traces streaked from the ship and bit the air near their wings. Anti-aircraft was immediate and sharp. Splashes of water leaped where shells missed. On the horizon, a plume of smoke climbed as one of their comrades flashed by with a hit on a lighter vessel. The patched Mitchell tightened its approach. The pilot used the tracers, strings of 50 cal tracers from wing guns framing the target, as a crude sight. And in the nose, the cannoneer readied the round that would, in a handful of seconds, decide whether the weekend jokes would be true or whether they'd be another hole in the syllabus of practical failures. They were almost at firing range when the escort opened up. The B-25 rolled into its shallow run, the ocean blurred. The sound of the 75mm firing was a savage punctuation mark. The recoil drove a new architecture of stress through the fuselage. For a breath it sounded like thunder had been invited into the cabin, and then there was a darker sound. Something on the target that answered with metal on metal. A different kind of report that said the ship had taken serious damage. The plane pulled up, circled, and the men saw what their shells had done. And then everything sharpened. The escort, which had seemed like a silhouette on a map, took on shape. Deck fittings gone, a list to starboard, men running and shouting. The patched Mitchell came around again, the crew gripped by the knowledge that they were now not only testers, but participants in a small, dangerous history. The second pass would tell whether this patched gun was a tool or a fluke. They lined up, the tracers painting the air, flak blooming around them. The pilot pushed the nose down. The cannoneer curled his fingers on the breech. The world narrowed to a single line between the plane and the ship. The next report of the 75mm would be more than noise. It would be an answer to every slide rule and sneer. The next report of the 75mm would be more than noise. It would be an answer to every slide rule and sneer. The gun barked. The Mitchell shuddered as if some great beast had struck it across the ribs. For a heartbeat, hot air and cordite filled the nose. The cannoneer felt the recoil shove through his forearms and spine, felt the cradle bite, and then let the barrel kiss the sky. Far below, the shell found purchase. From the cockpit, the world tightened to an act of geometry, angle, speed, distance, and the thin mercy of a crew who had practiced this sequence until their hands moved before thought. They watched the wake and then that impossible hole, less theatrical than the stories, but more devastating because it carried weight. The impact chewed into the escort's side, and men on deck turned from figures into frantic silhouettes. Smoke bloomed along a seam, a secondary flash answered inside the hull, and then the ship began to behave like a thing betrayed by its own weight. Water found seams that had never been designed to hold it. Pumps spun and coughed. The list crawled. On the second pass, the B-25 came in lower, tracers painting a razor line. The pilot eased the nose down, feeling how the aircraft's center of balance had shifted with every shot, counting the recoil like a metronome. The cannoneer rammed another round into the breech, fingers raw with friction and oil. They fired again. The shell hit amidships, low. The ship lurched, a groan transmitted through hull and mast and into the air like an exclamation point. Men ran in the open, faces turned toward a sky that had just taken lethal counsel. Nobody aboard the Mitchell pretended the job was elegant. They did not glorify the moment. They recorded it with the unflashy language of people who had traded rhetoric for consequence. One heavy escort disabled, one transport burning, convoy stalled. But for the men watching the damaged vessel slide lower and lower, there was a kind of brutal clarity. The patched gun had done what it promised, punctured the hull where it mattered, let the ocean in, and cut a line through a supply artery that the enemy relied upon. The damaged escort did not yield theatrically, as myths would later say, but it would not recover. Men abandoned it. Small boats took on survivors. The transport, already hit on the first pass, lay dead in the water, and later suffered a final set of hits, while circling aircraft finished what the gun had begun. By the time the patched Mitchells peeled away, the convoy was a cluster of drifting smoke and flotsam, the supply mission undone. Back at base, the mood was thick and complicated, relief braided with sorrow. They had proved the gun's worth with hard, visible outcomes, but the cost had been paid in human hours and risks. The cannoneers' hands were blistered and raw, the cockpit instruments rattled, and some never worked again, and the plane itself needed more than a touch-up. The modified nose would be stripped and examined under lamps and grease-streaked fingers. Men who had joked and joked again about the absurdity of firing a tank gun from a bomber now drank quietly and with intent. Laughter had changed its color. It was no longer masking disbelief, but calibrating gratitude and an almost embarrassed pride. Word traveled fast. The story, short and blunt in the daily reports, bloomed into the kind of tall tale that war loves. They laughed when they bolted a tank gun to a bomber. They stopped laughing when a single shell punched a hole the size of a bathtub in a warship. That headline was not quite literal. Mission logs used sober terms: escort, destroyer, escort warship. The men in bars used the word battleship because it made the joke into a legend. Both versions were true in their own ways. The mission had demonstrated an effect so out of step with doctrine that the narrative wanted to name it bigger, to let the absurdity of a tank gun doing naval work read as a direct affront to larger, more conventional enemies. General George Kenney read reports with a cautious interest. He did not indulge in instant celebration, but he did not forbid experimentation either. Higher command still wanted better data, broader tests, and a more formal plan to integrate the innovation into doctrine. That was the slow work. On the wing and under the corrugated hangars, the quick work continued: repairs, tweaks, and training. Mechanics worked until their shoulders ached, and then worked more. Cannoneers practiced loading until it was a reflex. Pilots learned to feel the plane's new temper. The cycle of improvisation, action, and incremental improvement had begun. It was not all victory. The ledger of losses was real. Some patched Mitchells never came back from their sorties. Shrapnel and a stray burst of anti-aircraft found their way into cramped noses. A jam at the wrong moment could leave a cannoneer praying he could clear a breach with burned palms and a heart like a fist. Fuel weight and the extra mass of the gun made takeoffs wobbly in rough air. There were nights when crews sat in the dark and counted names, and the quiet that followed felt like an indictment of a world at war. But innovation seldom waits for perfect comfort. The patched gun concept spread because the problem it solved was immediate and painful. Moving targets at sea were not easy to kill by doctrinal means, and when ships delivered supplies, they sustained ground troops and kept operations alive. Denying those convoys was an operational imperative. The patched Mitchells were not the only answer, but they were a practical, visible one. As the men refined technique, a few operational practices emerged as near law. High-angle bombing remained useful for certain tasks, but when the goal was to stop a ship now, when time and daylight mattered, a low, direct attack with a heavy, precise round had advantages. The skip shot was an especially striking trick. Instead of aiming to strike a hull directly and risk the round plunging at an unpredictable angle, gunners could aim for a point on the surface where the shell would ricochet and then strike low on the hull's side, circumventing heavier armor higher up. The physics of water and mass did much of the work. A shell arriving with the right angle and speed could snare a ship at its weakest seam. The use of 50 caliber tracers as an aim assist grew out of necessity and improvisation. It was a crude technique. Wing gunners would lay down tracer belts that formed a visible arc, and the pilot would use that arc as an aiming line, bringing the heavy 75mm into a firing solution by eye. To an engineer with a slide rule, this was crude. To a pilot with salt in his hair and the taste of failure fresh on his tongue, it was brilliant. Tactically, the psychological dimension was as valuable as the physical. Japanese captains, once willing to run in daylight, now began to delay. Risk assessment changed. The presence of a forward-firing heavy gun meant convoys could be interdicted with greater confidence. Some shipment schedules altered. Every delay, every reroute cost fuel, time, and the window for other operations. The patched Mitchells were not strategic silver bullets, but they were a new tooth in the tooth and claw of attrition. That attrition, however, exacted a human toll. Cannoneers were carved into a new kind of fatigue, muscles tuned to the rhythm of slamming rounds and the nerve to do it while flak starred the air. Pilots carried the stress of aligning fast-moving geometry with the knowledge that a single miscalculation could shatter the plane or leave the crew exposed. Mechanics faced the long, grinding hours of maintenance. Nose skins that had been hammered and riveted in the field often needed replacement, and spare parts were always in short supply. The improvisation that had rescued operations from doctrinal impotence demanded a different kind of sacrifice. The B-25G and later the B-25H embodied the transition from field hack to institutionalized innovation. The G model had been the first to carry the heavy cannon, but field feedback pointed to improvements. Engineers beefed up nose structure, altered recoil mounts, and rethought ammunition handling. The H model incorporated those lessons along with a heavier forward-firing battery. It presented a model closer to intentional design rather than ad hoc jury-rigging. In the long arc of military aviation, these designs fed into a lineage. The idea of concentrated, forward-directed firepower from aircraft to strike surface targets resurfaced in later gunships and attack aircraft. The AC-47 and the AC-130 that would come decades later are cousins in spirit, and the A-10's emphasis on survivable, concentrated gunfire for close air support resonates with the same logic. It is not a straight literal design line. Those planes answered different problems with different technologies, but the intellectual inheritance is clear. When a tactical problem demands direct, repeated, accurate fire, designers may turn to heavy, forward-mounted guns. For the men who had made the patched Mitchells work, the satisfaction was complicated. They were proud, but they had paid dearly. Captain Ed Lunner would be remembered for the missions he flew and for the steadiness he brought to his crew. He trusted those men the way a craftsman trusts his tools, with the knowledge that both could fail under the right pressure. Major Paul Pappy Gunn's name, part artilleryman, part evangelist for pragmatic work, would be attached to the idea in field law, whether the paperwork always bore his name or not. General Kenny's cautious endorsement would help move the concept up the chain. But most of the actual bravery and the small miracles were the work of crews and mechanics who could not be found in grand dispatches. The post-mission logistics were as mundane as they were essential. Crews wrote reports that were, by necessity, structured and bare. These reports would later feed memos that became policies. Wartime storytellers would embellish bath-size holes, a battleship sunk by one round, the audacity of a tank gun breaking the sea's etiquette. Those stories served an important social function. They turned technical improvisation into legend, and in so doing built morale and a taste for invention. But the official records kept a different tone. One of escort disabled, transport destroyed, convoy disrupted. Both frames matter. One tells how men made sense of what they had done. The other gives a sober account of what they actually achieved. Over time, those patched Mitchells faded from the front line. New aircraft designs and different tactical priorities moved air power elsewhere. The planes themselves aged and were scrapped. The men were reassigned or killed or returned home. The crude, brilliant nose modifications that had once been a center of furious activity were cut off and recycled into peacetime industry. Parts were stamped, sold, and melted down. Stories, too, eroded, letters yellowed. Veterans died, and museum curators sometimes chose shinier artifacts for public display. The work of improvisers often ends up in footnotes unless someone insists on remembering. But memory, even when partial, leaves things in its wake. The patched Mitchells and their gunners had altered habit and doctrine. Japanese captains altered convoys. Commanders adjusted tactics. Aircraft design began to respect the idea that carefully placed heavy guns could tilt a fight in ways bombs and machine gun strafes could not. In small but meaningful increments, the Mitchell's nose gun helped build a language of close, concentrated fire delivered accurately from the air. Not all the men who carried this story to the bars, mess halls, and later memoirs lived to read how their improvisation shaped future design. Captain Edelner, whose steadiness had become part of the crew's lore, was later killed in action, one of many small tragedies that threaded the campaign. The loss wrote an extra line of gravity beneath the anecdote. Stories of laughter turned solemn. Jokes about making a battleship cry became whispers about what the men had done and what it cost. There were critics who remained unconvinced. To some doctrinal purists, the patched Mitchells were a necessary evil, a cheat of sorts. They pointed out the risks, the increasing vulnerability to concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and the fact that not every mission ended in success. Those criticisms were real and often prescient. But the innovation's defenders, pilots, cannoneers, mechanics, had an answer that was not arithmetic but necessity. In certain operational spaces, a patched solution that delivered results was better than a pristine doctrine that failed when measured against live targets. The broader legacy is not a tidy claim. It is not that one odd experiment produced the A-10, the AC-47, and all modern gunships in a single stroke. The legacy is cultural and practical, a willingness among lower echelon operators to fix a tactical gap, a willingness among some commanders to trust empiricism over pure modeling, and a set of technical lessons about mounting heavy armament on aircraft that would echo in later design considerations. The patched Mitchells taught something engineers already knew in different language. Concentrated kinetic force is valuable when it can be delivered accurately and repeatedly. What the crews added was the willingness to accept an ugly, dangerous method to get that force where it needed to be. The men who had lived through those missions told the story often in small human ways. They described the smell of spent propellant, the shudder of the recoil, the taste of salt when flying low enough that spray glossed the windscreen. They told about loading shells in the nose by the feel of the round, not by sight, about fingers that learned not to hesitate, about songs hummed under breath to steady hands. They told about the moment when machinery and muscle and fear aligned into a fleeting competence that was enough to change a mission's outcome. There was also the sober business of tallying loss. Men were wounded, and planes were lost. Some of the crews who had been the first adopters did not live to see their work recognized in doctrine or to witness the slower institutional embrace of their tactics. The Army's scrap pile eventually ate the airplanes. The modifications were cut away, and the raw steel was repurposed. Museums would later preserve some machines, but often the patched, battered noses that had seen the fiercest work were long gone, discarded as obsolete metal. The human story, however, persisted in letters, in after-action reports, and in the mouths of veterans who had lived long enough to tell it. To be sure, the patched Mitchells did not win the war. They were one prong in a broad, painful effort. Yet their story illuminates a recurring dynamic of combat, When doctrine proves brittle, frontline improvisation can provide brittle, immediate fixes that shift tactical balance. The patched Mitchells are an emblem of that truth, a rough human solution that met an urgent problem and changed behavior in measurable ways. When the smoke cleared and the oceans calmed enough for historians to begin cataloguing the oddities of innovation, the phrase in the bars persisted. They laughed at his revolutionary tank cannon until it sunk a battleship. The phrase will always be a touch out of step with precise logs. The mission's reports speak of an escort disabled and a transport lost. But wartime legend, which trades in emotional truth rather than forensic categories, amplified the story into an image that captured something truer than a technical classification. A single improvised idea, born of frustration and grease and courage, could alter the conduct of operations and force an enemy to change his ways. That duality, legend and ledger, is central to how we remember technological improvisation. The embellishment into Battleship is not an attempt to lie. It is a cultural way of saying that the effect was larger than the object. It is worth stating plainly. The popular retelling swelled the target into a battleship. The formal records describe an escort and a transport. Both accounts sit in the story together. The ledger for historians, the legend for the men who needed a simple metaphor to contain the complexity of what they'd done. In the decades after the war, the lineage from patched Mitchell to later gunships became a subject of study among military historians and designers. The idea of a platform that carried a heavy, forward-directed weapon, survivable and accurate, found different expressions in airplanes built specifically for that kind of fighting. Those later machines, benefiting from more robust engineering and a peacetime capacity to develop doctrine and logistics, arguably did what the improvised Mitchells had attempted but could not be refined to do at the time. Still, the improvised work on the Mitchells was an important node, an example that sometimes in combat the problem dictates its own solutions. The men who pulled this off, and who paid in fatigue and in blood, did not always get medals or headlines matched to their work. In many cases their planes were stripped and their names folded into reports. Some veterans felt cheated by the way history can forget the messy middle where progress actually happens. Others took quiet satisfaction in knowing they had made a difference. There is a certain dignity in that unglamorous knowledge, the understanding that some innovations are not produced in laboratories, but in hangars and on damp flight lines, in the hands of people who have to make something work right now. When historians or enthusiasts retell this episode today, there is a temptation to smooth its edges, make the technical problems cleaner, the outcomes crisper, and the moral calculus simpler. But the real story resists simplification. The patched Mitchell with its 75mm M4 was at once improv and inspiration, tool and danger, triumph and cost. It changed some things and left other problems untouched. It taught men new ways to aim violence, and in doing so taught planners new ways to think about aircraft and weapon integration. On the human side, the cannoneers remained the smallest, hardest-hitting protagonists. Their work was largely invisible and intensely physical. The build-up of calluses, the precise slam of a breech, the double-check of a cartridge in a pitch-black nose, the breath behind one more loading cycle as flak bulbed in the water beside them. Those men bore their part of the innovation like a weight, and like any true weight, it told them something about who they were and what they'd been willing to do. There is a kind of bitter beauty in that. To watch a ship choke on its own compartments and sink because a man in a cramped metal nose kept repeating the same motion is to see human agency at its rawest. It is neither noble nor base in moralese terms. It is pragmatic, and in war, pragmatism is often the only virtue left standing. The final reports on those early missions circulated upward and outward, Commanders debated, engineers iterated, and a new generation of designers absorbed lessons that would be applied under different conditions and with greater resources. The immediate practical outcomes, convoys delayed, supplies denied, enemy behavior altered, were concrete. The longer-term outcomes, design lessons and tactical norms, were more diffuse but arguably enduring. If there is a moral, it is not a moral at all, but an observation. Innovation in war is often messy and rarely clean, emerging from necessity and stubbornness, and the willingness of a few people to accept disproportionate risk. When doctrine is wrong-footed by the conditions of combat, frontline ingenuity can do what plans cannot. The patched Mitchells are one vivid example, an ugly, dangerous fix that yielded effects and shaped future thinking. At the end of the day, the patched Mitchells belong to the kind of warfare that admits both improvisation and consequence. Men who had patched and loaded lived with the knowledge that their work might be celebrated in a barroom anecdote as the moment a battleship cried into the sea. They also lived with the more sober knowledge recorded in official logs, that their actions had disabled an escort, sunk a transport, and left a convoy in ruins. Both truths coexist, and both are necessary for the full picture. When you stand back from the arc of the story, of men who laughed, men who bolted, men who fired, and ships that later slipped beneath waves, you can see a pattern. Mockery marked the beginning, necessity wrote the procedure, courage provided the repetition. The patched Mitchell was an answer formed in smoke and grease, and its effects radiated outward, altering tactics and, in small ways, design. The men who lived that story are the reason the idea moved from joke to hated respect. So, remember the cannoneer bent in a cramped nose, the pilot counting out the approach, the mechanic with oil in his fingernails. Remember the ledger that recorded a crippled escort and a lost transport. Remember, too, the barroom versions that called it a battleship, because sometimes legend carries what the ledger cannot make tidy. If this story surprised you, hit like and tell us in the comments which forgotten innovations you think deserve a closer look.